Hey, happy Saturday morning. I think I'm live. I'm watching my computer here. I'm looking at the camera, but I'm also trying not to look at my computer screen because they're in two different locations. But happy Saturday morning, and I don't know how many people are out there this morning, probably in Facebook Live land, but I'm here, and if you're here with me, that's great. I know my wife's getting ready to walk out the door, so I know she's not paying any attention to me this morning, but hopefully there's somebody out there who is. If not, if it's just me and I learned something from this, that's great. But I thought I would take a few minutes on a Saturday morning uh, just to uh, just to go over some things I've been learning over the last few weeks. Certainly, as our nation has been walking through this certainly different times, probably a crisis like none of us have ever experienced. It's very different. It's amazing to me how quickly such a crisis um, can like this can impact our whole society. Um, everything is turned upside down and everything is shut down. Just reminds me of how much we are not in control of anything. And I'm going to kind of look here to see on this if just to make sure that everything's working good. Um, um, and hopefully that you can hear me. But just again, a reminder of how quickly things can get out of our control, and we have to really rely on the Lord. We're not in control of a whole lot of things. We think we are, and there are certainly things we can control and we should control. I had a discussion last night with my youngest daughter. We were talking in the car, and my comment to her was, we can't worry about the things that we can't control right now. We just got to focus on the things we can control, and the things we can't control, we have to leave in the Lord's hands and do what we can do uh, to help the circumstances, to make sure that we don't make things worse. But that's tough sometimes because the reason we start to get anxious and the reason we start to worry is because we start to put our focus on things that we can't control. So I wanted to share just a brief statement here. I wrote this down earlier as I've been preparing my notes. Roddy Galbraith from the John Maxwell team. Roddy is the speaking coach or the speaking trainer, if you will, there with the John Maxwell team. Probably the men on this team and the women on the team there at John Maxwell are absolutely the best. They're the best in the world. And I think he said this the other day. We sat through I don't know 3 days of training and of just good information on leading through a crisis. And he made this statement. He said, "Never tell a story without a point, and never make a point without telling a story." So one of the things I want to try to do too is bring some life to some of the things that we'll learn here today through some illustrations, through some stories. During my 20 years in the Air Force, I had the opportunity to learn from and sit under the teaching of some great leaders. I take for granted sometimes that the leadership that I had the opportunity to work for, the men who I would say they had big brains, and man, they were just incredible leaders, and they had learned from incredible leaders. And sometimes I forget that. I forget that not everybody gets that opportunity. And the things that I was able to learn and still apply to my life today were forged under the fire of working for these men. And some of those names are the first one that stuck out to me was General Darren McDew. General Darren McDew was a four-star general. He just retired last year. Four-star general. Worked. He and I worked together for several months, deployed a deployed location, and one of the most humble men that I've ever met, but a tremendous leader. Matter of fact, though he outranked me and outsmarted me tremendously, he still took the time with me to eat lunch with me. He and I would go run together. We ran 5K races together, and just a very approachable man, humble man, and just taught me a tremendous amount about leading, uh, how to handle situations. So just forged my thinking in a whole different direction. The other one I wrote down was General Gary Trexler. General Trexler was, again, a very humble man, but a very pointed man. I'll never forget when he hired me to work as his executive officer. He said, Todd, he goes, I mentor in one way, and that way is my foot up your rear end. And if you don't like that, this probably isn't the job for you. And but again, he taught me so much, and I was forever grateful for the things that he showed me. Another one was General David Deptula. General Deptula was the architect of the air war during Desert Storm. Probably one of the most sought after leaders that I ever worked for. The phone rang incessantly when I worked for him from people across the globe wanting his mentorship, his advice. What a challenging time that was for me to work for him. But again, his brilliance taught me so much. Another one I wrote down here was General Tommy Franks. I didn't have a lot of interaction with General Franks. I used to be on the crew that flew him all over the world. This was just prior to 9/11, 2001, and I had a lot of opportunities to interact with him and talk with him and his staff. And he ended up being the general, the 4-star, who led our forces right after 9/11 into Afghanistan and then into Iraq. And again, just wow, brilliant men and their staffs, just brilliant. And then the last one I wrote down here was not so much of and is not so much of a military leader, but is who I learned from today, and that is the John Maxwell team. And I have made a commitment. Here I'm touching my face. I shouldn't be touching my face, right? So that was a no-no here. But I had the opportunity and still have the opportunity to learn under the John Maxwell team, which is a financial sacrifice for me, because that means that's a service you pay for, and it is not cheap, but it is worth it. Every dime of it is worth it. And I'm enrolled in their mentorship program. I am enrolled in several of their programs there. But you cannot put a price on the advice and the teaching and the mentorship that you receive from these men and ladies too. I mean, some great ladies on this team that are just tremendous as well. So with that said, I wrote down some things. I'm going to refer to my paper because I wanted to get these notes down and for us this morning to make sure I didn't deviate from anything. A crisis will show us several things: leadership, leaders in crisis, followers in crisis. Whether you're a leader or a follower, at some point you're leading and following, or leading or following during any time in your day-to-day routine, but especially in a time of crisis. But the essence of leadership will come out in a crisis. The very essence of leadership is going to be revealed in a time of crisis. And that leader's job in a time of crisis is flat out two words: give hope. The people who work under them and the team that they have are looking for hope in this situation. They're looking for an end. So there's some things that they need to know from you as a leader, and you're going to have to do three things. You're going to have to communicate hope. You're going to have to educate toward hope, and thirdly, you're going to have to be authentic. So you're going to have to authenticate hope by your own words and your own actions. I have to do that. You have to do that. So we've got to communicate it, we've got to educate it, and then we've got to authenticate it. Those three things there. So what in a time of crisis, I listed here this morning 4 things. I've been thinking about this over the last few days. 4 things that I have listed here that I think we need to take away. And I don't want to spend a lot of time here because I know it's Saturday. People are busy. People have things to do. And so I want to take just a brief amount of time here to go over this. In the leadership summit we had the last 3 days with John Maxwell, he said the number one thing, when going into a crisis, your number one priority of all things is people. The number one thing we have to take care of. So if you're taking notes, your number one thing when we go into a crisis, when we're in a crisis, when we're dealing with things like this, is we've got to make sure the people are taken care of, because people are our greatest resource. They're our greatest assets. If you watch the daily news briefings with the president, he's got a team of people around him. They're advising him. He's not the expert, but he brings experts around him. The leader can't know it all, but he's got to be able to tap into it all. And so he's got to have that team. He's got to have his people. They've got to be on board. So he's got to communicate some things to those people. Uh, First of all, do they believe in us as leaders? They have to believe in us as a leader. We have to have compassion, we have to have integrity, and we have to have consistency. And those three things right there occur. Compassion, consistency, and integrity. They have to occur before the crisis ever shows its head. Ever before the crisis ever reveals itself, we have to be leading and demonstrating a life of compassion, of integrity, of consistency, of courage, of all of those things. We have to be decisive in our decisions in a crisis. We have to be decisive in decision making. Your people have to know that you're confident in the decisions, and I'm confident in the decisions that we're making. And if we're wrong, and we admit that, and we correct the course. But there's got to be decisiveness. We've got to be able to motivate the team. We've got to be able to keep the team focused on the mission at hand. We'll talk a little bit more about that. We have to continue to lay out expectations for our people. What are the expectations? And those expectations can change. Right now, we have to be honest about the situation, and to be honest about the situation, none of us really knows what the future is going to look like. We just don't know what that future is. We know what we have to do today. We know what we have to do right now. But how many people will get the virus? Who will be affected? We don't know that. There's a lot of speculation out there. We can't live on speculation, but we have to keep a proper perspective on the crisis at hand. Remember, anytime we're in a crisis, we think it's the worst that's ever been, and it's not. This is not the worst crisis that we've ever been through. It's certainly no small potatoes, but it's not the worst thing. We have to keep communicating that perspective to our people. We have to keep things in context. I read this morning. I thought, just to provide perspective, you're not stuck at home. That's how we can view this, as we're stuck at home, or we can view this as we're safe at home. Are you stuck at home, or are you safe at home? It's all about perspective. It's all about how you view it. We have to keep things in context. Things often appear much worse than they are. John said the other day, John Maxwell said just on this past Sunday, he said, fear will spread faster than the virus. And that is the truth. Fear, we have so many things that will feed us fear. The press is going to feed us fear. Your neighbors are going to feed you fear. Your own mind is going to feed you fear. If you keep reading the stats and the numbers and everything is going to feed into your fears. I ran into some EMT workers yesterday, and we asked them a couple of questions about how busy they were and things they were doing, and they kind of said, hey, we think the worst of this is going to be next week, but they don't know. We can't live in that fear. We have to live cautiously, and we have to live smartly, and we have to live confidently, but we can't live in fear. God has not given us a spirit of fear. So when that fear comes in, and it's going to come in, remember that fear is not coming from the Lord. It's coming from our uncertainty about the situation, and we're not trusting God to get us through it. But at the same time, we have to be smart. We can't just be stupid and say, "Oh, God's gonna take care of me." We have to follow the guidelines that we've been given by our leaders, and then by our governor, by our president, by our mayor, and by our medical specialists, our health officials. We have to follow those guidelines, but not in fear, in confidence. So people have to be your priority. That's number one. Number two, we have to keep our people and ourselves positive. Filter out negativity in your own life. Filter out that negativity in your teams and their attitudes as well. A crisis will reveal, again, John said the other day, he said a crisis is going to reveal what's in you. Crises don't so much mold you, though they can to some effect, but more than that, a crisis will reveal what's inside of you, and that it squeezes you. And what's going to come out of you? Is fear coming out? Is dread coming out? Is negativity coming out? Or are we seeing opportunity? Are we seeing things, how we can change, how we can better ourselves, how we can be a blessing to other people? Is that what we're doing? Do we focus on those positives? Again, growth. Are we focusing on growth opportunities? Are we focusing on wisdom that we're going to gain? Are we focusing on how we can be more flexible in the situation at hand and how we can help our neighbor? What can we do to be a better Christian? What can we do to be a better coworker? What can we do to be a better neighbor? All of those things have to be introduced by the leader to his people. I had a man tell me yesterday who's in our men's home. He said he's coming up on his time to go to work in our program, and he said, "Man, I don't know if I'll be able to go to work. I don't know with all this turmoil." And I said, or you'll have more opportunities to go to work, because what opportunities will be created from this crisis that might have not been there before? Let's flip this. Let's flip the script, so to speak, if we could say that. So people have got to be our priority. We've got to focus on keeping our people positive and ourselves positive. People, that's the number one priority, right? Number two, crisis planning. In the military, we had a term called crisis action planning. Notice those words: crisis action, crisis action. Crisis requires action. And I pulled this up off of some publications online, some old military publications. Crisis action planners base their plan on the circumstances that exist at the time the planning occurs. So we're when we're planning, when we're thinking, and when we're planning for crisis, and usually we plan for crisis before the crisis occurs. We plan with what we know. What's going to happen, though, is the unknown things are going to come in there as the crisis unfolds. So in our planning, we have to make sure that, number one, we stay liquid. Number one, when we're planning, we have to stay liquid. That means flexible. I was talking to somebody last night, and he said cash is king because cash is liquid. If I have cash in my pocket, a lot of times I can buy something cheaper because I have cash in my pocket. I'm not using credit. I'm not borrowing money. Cash is flexible. Cash is king. Well, being flexible is king in a crisis, and especially in planning. A crisis is again, it's a time of growth. We talked about that just a minute ago. So we have to understand that when we're planning for a crisis, we're also going to be planning for times of growth. We have to keep that in mind. We have to make sure that we have a flexible plan, a plan that's going to bend. So when we're planning that, we have to allow for these things to adaptability, flexibility, all those things. Planning gives you leverage. What do I mean by that? So planning is liquid. Planning gives you leverage. I want to think as little as possible, and I'll tell you what I mean by that in a minute. I want to think as little as possible in the middle of a crisis. That's because if I've planned well, then my thinking has already been done for me before the crisis occurred. I don't want to have to be thinking about the basics in the crisis because I've already thought through those things. I don't want to have to be thinking about things that I should have already thought about prior to this. In the crisis, I don't want to be thinking about how am I going to pay for my mortgage. Well, if I had been planning for this, for any crisis, I should have money set aside to pay those bills for a certain amount of time. Most financial planners will tell you you need to have 6 months worth of savings set up, 6 months worth of living expenses, so you are able to pay your bills. Therefore, in the crisis, you're not worried about how you're going to pay your bills. You already have that planned out, and now you can take care of the other things. So many of us are living day to day in crisis mode, and we shouldn't be because we're failing to plan. So planning gives you leverage. It allows you to eliminate and resolve those issues beforehand. I'll never forget, back in 1992, we were on a mission, and we took off out of New York. I was stationed there then, and we flew from New York. And we left there, and we flew into Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii. We got there, and we flew out of there from there, and we were going into Bangkok, Thailand. It was in the middle of the night that we were over the Pacific Ocean. And over the Pacific Ocean, we lost all of our navigation equipment, and it was again the middle of the night. There was thunderstorms everywhere. It was the summertime. We've lost our navigation equipment, and because we had thoroughly planned the mission, I didn't have to think about all the basics. Now all we had to think about was how are we going to navigate. And what we went back to is we went back to our training. We went back to our planning. And for the next 3 hours, we flew that mission into Bangkok, Thailand, with no navigation equipment, in the middle of the night, in thunderstorms. A very pulling your hair out experience. And I'll never forget, the rest of the crew kept asking me, "Are we okay? Are we okay? Are we good? How are we doing on time? How are we? Are you sure you know where we are?" And I kept saying, "I'm positive we're going to get there. I'm positive I know where we are. I'm positive we're in the location." Now, I'll be honest with you, I wasn't completely positive about all of that, but I wanted to keep giving them encouragement. And when we finally got within radar range of Bangkok, Thailand, and we started to paint the land on that radar, it was a whew. But that time, that experience, man, it helped build my confidence. I knew I had a plan that I could rely on, that I could keep coming back to. I didn't have to think about the basics. I just needed to go back to my training and do the things I was taught to do. Boy, did it build confidence in me and my abilities to navigate that airplane and get the mission accomplished. So that crisis did that, but we were ready for it. We were planning. We don't want it to happen, but we were ready for it, and we planned it. So planning gives you leverage, and planning also helps you set limits. It helps you to weed out what's not important at the time of the crisis. It's better to plan the mission. We would always plan the mission at 0 miles per hour on the ground in our unit, because when the crisis hit in the airplane, it was going to hit at 400 miles per hour. And at 400 miles per hour, again, is not the time that you want to be trying to figure out what the priorities are. You figure out what the priorities are in a crisis before you ever take off. That's when you figure out what the priorities are. You need to be figuring out what the priorities are now for the next crisis that you're planning for. Financially, what are they? All of those things. If your house, heaven forbid, if your house ever catches on fire, where are you going to meet? What's your family going to do? Who are they going to contact? All those things. Have that plan laid out. When I was in survival school back in 1989, I went to survival school, and survival school was weeks and weeks of what we call beating and bleeding. You were tortured, you were humiliated, you were emotionally and physically abused for a length of time. For a period of time in there, they would strip you of your clothes, and you would operate during the day with no clothes. There was a lot of humiliation involved with it. A lot of again, mental torture, physical torture, emotional torture. But you did that in a controlled environment in order to plan for the event that you were ever captured and became a POW. And what it did, it helped me to establish what are my values. What were the values that I was establishing? Boy, did it reveal some weaknesses to me. Boy, put yourself in a situation like that, and you're going to find out real fast what your weaknesses are. So planning does that. Planning helps me to identify those weaknesses. It helps me to set limits. Okay, so number 1 is people. Number 2 is planning. Number 3 I put down here is processes. When in a crisis, what are your basics? Stick to those basics. Your people need to know what those processes are. Man, as much as you can, stick to that schedule. Stick to your processes. What is it that makes you your money? Keep doing that. Okay, keep your people focused on the processes as much as possible. In the Air Force, we would call, if we had an emergency in the airplane, an engine went out, we took a bird strike, whatever would happen, whatever the emergency was, the first thing you had to do was fly the airplane. Fly the airplane. That was, go back to what's the process? Do not get distracted and do something that will make things worse, that would kill you. Fly the airplane. That was the process. That was the priority. Know what that priority is. Know what those processes are that you have to stick to. I'll never forget, we were flying missions over Bosnia, and we were coming back in on a late night mission, and the co-pilot was in the right seat, gonna land the airplane. And Scott Grant was the aircraft commander. One of my favorite people in the world is Scott Grant. I think he's now the wing commander out at Birmingham at the unit out there at Birmingham, Alabama. And but I'll never forget. We came in. The co-pilot was landing. The winds were really squirrely that night. And when we touched down, the co-pilot, I mean, it was one of the worst landings I've ever seen in my life. Anyway, we bounced so high. I thought it was unbelievable. And I'll never forget, Scott was so calm in that left seat. And all Scott kept looking at the co-pilot. Co-pilot's name was Bob. He said, "Bob, fly the plane. Bob, keep her steady." I mean, Scott was so calm and cool. And man, it was just Scott was an incredible leader, and he's in a position today where because of his incredible leadership. But keep flying that airplane. Stick to the processes. You've developed them for a reason. Don't deviate from them now. If you stick to the basics and the fundamentals in your planning or in your processes in your organization, this will help to keep your people from panicking and freezing. Will they be anxious? Yes. Will they be nervous? Yes. But you'll know that you've been effective as a leader if they're still sticking to those processes. They're not frozen. They're not panicking. In a crisis, there's going to be lots of emotional swings. There's going to be economic swings. There's going to be expectation swings. There's going to be all of those things. But if we stick to the basics, that helps your people focus, and it helps the leader focus. For me, I have to come back to, I've got to keep my eye on the Word of God and truth. I've got to keep coming back to truth. What does God say? What does God say? He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. He's unchanging, and in that, that's where I gauge back to. That's what keeps me focused, and it keeps me grounded. So, lastly, okay, the fourth thing I'll give you. The first one was people are your priority. Number 2 is planning. Right? Make sure our planning is liquid. Make sure it gives us leverage, and make sure it helps set limits to keep the noise out. Thirdly, we talked about the processes. Fly the airplane. Period. Fly the airplane. Fourthly, one of my biggest lessons, because I struggle with this, is patience. Patience, great leadership. And I observed this in all of the generals that I worked for. A lot of people think, because of the movies and because of television, that military leadership is impatient and irritable, and that's not true at all. I mean, there might be some, but that's the greatest leaders that I worked for showed an incredible amount of patience. So much so that sometimes it made me uncomfortable. And I'll give you a story here, and I'll close with this. We were working an issue one day. I was a staff planner. I was a war planner at Hickam Air Force Base for the Pacific Air Forces from 2001 to 2004, and it was a tremendous, especially in I got there right before 9/11 kicked off, and there was a tremendous amount of pressure, strain. Man, it was an incredible pressure time for me and for those of us who were planners, war planners, setting priorities, getting troops and aircraft moved in places. Well, as time went by, I ended up working for General Trexler, Gary Trexler, and I learned a tremendous amount from this man. And I'll never forget, this was a couple of years removed now from 9/11, and we were working you work a lot of political issues there. Politicians drive changes to obviously military structure and priorities, and we had some senators who were pushing for us to put certain types of airplanes up in Alaska, and the belief across the command was that we didn't need those airplanes there, but for political reasons, politicians wanted those airplanes up in Alaska, and the leadership did not agree with that. But the leadership answers to civilian leadership, so a lot of times it doesn't matter what the military thinks. It's what does Congress want and what does the president want. And at the time, some of our political leaders were pushing for things that we weren't quite in agreement with. And I'll never forget, we were working that issue, and the final package for approval had gone to my boss, and the deadline was approaching, and I was getting heat from from higher level leadership to get that package approved and signed off by my boss. And I went in there one day and I said, "Boss," I said, "Sir," and he's a general officer, so I'm a major in the Air Force at the time. And I was like, "Sir," I said, we're just a couple of days away from that when that package is due. I'm just reminding you." And he just looked at me and shook his head. And he didn't say much. I mean, he just said, "Thank you, Todd. You can leave now." And I was like, "Okay." So another day went by and I went back and I reminded him again. And he looked at me and he said, "Thank you, Todd." He said, "You can leave now." So finally, the day came that the package was due to higher authorities. And I said, "Sir," I said, "I just want to let you know that today's the day that have you made a decision?" And he said, "Todd, I got you. You can leave my office now." So I walked out and went back to my desk and did my job. And a couple of days have passed and time keeps going. And now it's past due for when this is due. And I'm getting phone calls and I'm taking the heat. That was my job. My job was to take the heat for the boss. And so I went in there and I said, "Hey, boss," I said, "what are you thinking?" And he looked at me and he said, "Todd, let me tell you something." He said, "A lot of times you don't know the answer you don't have a solution to the problem." He said, "And I don't have a solution to this problem." He said, "But all I know is I've got to be patient." And he goes, "And I'm willing to take the heat to be late and remain patient and wait for the answer to reveal itself to me." He said, "One thing I've learned in my career is the answer will always reveal itself." And I thought, wow, that was powerful. And I said, "That sounds just like the Lord, doesn't it?" He says, wait on me, wait on me. And even when it gets uncomfortable, wait on me. And it's interesting, he didn't move on that package. And eventually the answer did reveal itself as to what we needed to do. But what a huge lesson to me, and what a huge lesson he taught me that day, was patience. I take that with me to this day. When I get impatient, I really do. I take that lesson with me as well. We got to wait. We got to pray. We got to seek counsel, and God will show us the answers that we need in a time of crisis. I'll close with this. There's several books that I've read or am reading over the years that have impacted me as well, and two of them are by John Maxwell that I want to leave you with today. And one of them, my oldest daughter, gave me years ago for Christmas, and I've read this book probably 4 or 5 times, and I go back to it many times. And it's called, I'll put it up here. It's called Failing Forward. Failing Forward by John Maxwell is one of the greatest books I've ever read. Outside of the Bible, obviously, and it taught me so many lessons. Another one is more recent one by John Maxwell is one you might want to get, and it's Leadership, fairly new, maybe a couple of years now, if that, by John. Again, a tremendous book. And one that I'm in the middle of now, really finished it up, is and it's by a guy named Don Barden, PhD. Behavioral economist, and it's called The Perfect Plan. And really some neat stuff in here. A 10-year study on the world's top 1% leaders, if you will. The elite of the elite. It would be if you were studying football teams, obviously in the NFL they're all at the top of their game. But if you want to go at the top, you'd have to look at coaches. You'd have to look at the coach for the New England Patriots. He would be the top, So of all the elites, how is he the most elite? And it's a study. It's that type of study for 10 years, and he makes some interesting observations when it comes to success and to leading through and getting to the other side. And a lot of it centers around how you relate to people, how you and I relate to people. And he makes a couple of very interesting observations. People, 85% of the decisions that people make in their lives, or when people make decisions, 85% of what they base their decision on is how they feel about something. How they feel about something makes up, this is what 10 years of research has shown him, how they feel about something. How you make them feel, how I make them feel, it makes up 85% of what drives their yes or no or whatever that decision is. 15% of their decision is then based on the facts. Okay. Now, let's remember this too, that this is what the research shows as well, is that 94%, or when I give you the facts, when you're watching this video, at the end of it, you will only remember, he reveals this as well through his research, you will only remember 6% of what I tell you. 10 minutes after this video is done, 10 minutes after you watch me, you're only going to remember 6% of what I tell you. But you'll remember 94% of how you felt. Isn't that amazing? So of the 15% facts that we make a decision on, of that, we're only going to remember 6% of that. So we're emotional creatures. Remember that as we're leading through a crisis. We are emotional creatures. And sometimes those emotions tend to get the best of us. And our job as leaders is to lead through that emotion, and is to lead to the other side, is to keep people first, right? It's to plan. Make sure our plan is good, and that we're refining that plan, and we're refining our processes. We got to refine them, we got to define them, we got to refine them, right? And then those processes are the same way. And then patience. We have to be patient through the storm and through the crisis. I hope I've been a help to you today. If not, at least we got a little chance to chat, and I spent 36 minutes this morning at least helping myself to become a better leader. If nothing else, I hope I could help you. If you ever have the opportunity to want to discuss this some more, you can certainly get a hold of us. 478-284-1422 is Debbie. Debbie is my assistant. Call there, 478-284-1422. Or you can contact me through Facebook here, message me or whatever, and we can certainly continue the conversation offline at some time. But I hope you have a great Saturday. Keep your focus. Keep your focus on the other side of this. We're going to come out stronger and better, and who knows what opportunities this will present us. Have a great weekend.